Well, thank you for attending tonight's presentation. Each year, the organizers for the Camden Conference reach out to libraries across Maine and connect us with experts that they have called upon to discuss the most pressing topics of the day. This year, the theme for the Camden Conference is Europe, Challenged at Home and Abroad. The conference will be held on the last weekend of this month, February 25th through the 27th, and it will be held entirely virtual due to COVID precautions. You can find a wealth of information about these upcoming events and topics on their website. The Portland Public Library would like to thank them for this wonderful opportunity. Tonight's presentation by William Hall is the last Camden Conference community event that the Portland Library will be holding this year. Please visit the Portland Public Library's website. We have some really great events that you may be interested. And we purchased just about all of the suggested reading lists that the Camden Conference organizers shared with us. So you can find that list both on our site and the Camden Conference site. And so with no further ado, I'd like to turn this over to V, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you, V. Yep.
I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Camden Conference. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program at Portland Public Library. And we thank them very much for making these talks possible. As Miles has said, our Camden Conference weekend starts just 10 days from today. It's our 35th annual conference. As Miles said, Europe challenged at home and abroad. And if you would like information on ticketing, please go to camdenconference.org, where you can also find our roster of 10 terrific international speakers. Since we're here tonight to talk about Eastern Europe, I'll just mention two of them. One is Director of Southeastern European Studies at Oxford University, Othon Anastasakis, and also former U.S. permanent representative to NATO, Douglas E. Lute. Leading up to the conference, we offer a series of free community events like this one at public libraries from York to Southwest Harbor, in keeping with our mission to foster informed discourse on world issues by providing background and to touch on topics related to the conference. It is my pleasure to welcome William Hall, tonight's community event speaker. Bill is president of the World Affairs Council of Maine. He was an intelligence officer in the US Air Force and spent nearly 18 years abroad in Asia and Europe. He's a graduate of Princeton University with a bachelor's degree in politics, and from the University of Virginia with a master's degree in world affairs. He lives on Peaks Island, as some of you have already heard, with his wife, Nancy. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Bill.
Okay, thank you, V. Good. It's great to have everybody here this evening. And it's really a thrill to be helping out the Camden Conference in kind of an indirect way, because we, as I said, we're doing lots of local community presentations. And the topic for tonight, for everyone who's attending, is going to be Eastern Europe. And I thought this was a perfect moment because the Camden Conference is about Europe. So here we go. This is Eastern Europe, and I'll explain a little more about what that means. But it's also a really significant time because it's 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, which I think is a really interesting time frame to consider Eastern Europe and take a look at it. Interestingly enough, when I did this presentation, things were a little bit, whoops, I'm running ahead here. My slides are running out of control. It was fairly quiet in Eastern Europe. Things weren't so good in some places, but nothing as exciting as what's going on today. And in fact, today, President Biden made a talk specifically focused on Ukraine and the Russian buildup around Ukraine. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to introduce you a little bit to Eastern Europe, talk a little bit about what it is, the countries that are involved, a little bit about their economies and so forth. And then I'm going to talk about, well, when the Soviet Union fell, what happened? What did we expect? What did the United States expect to happen as a result of this fall of the Soviet Union, which was truly a traumatic event, a great event for the world and obviously for the United States and all of us Americans. And then what actually did happen? So over the course of those next 30 years, what did happen? Did it meet any of our expectations? And then I'm going to ask, well, where are we now? What's going on in Eastern Europe right now? And a little bit about what does the future look like? Now, obviously, what's going on now is quite a bit different from what it was 6 months ago. So I've added a little extra at the end, which is not surprising, a little bit more about Ukraine and about the situation in Ukraine. So I added that to the presentation. But I think, first of all, I'd like to get started on what is Eastern Europe? Where is this place? And by the way, there is no common definition of Eastern Europe. So you run into a lot of different definitions of what is the part of Europe that is called Eastern Europe and what countries are actually in it. And I kind of picked one that's probably not too uncommon. I picked 20 countries that I decided were going to represent Eastern Europe. And they generally stretch in the area, if I put it roughly, from, say, Germany all the way over to Russia. And that's what I'm going to call Eastern Europe. So that's the place that I'm talking about. So if you take those 20 countries and you put them all together, you have a space about 22% of the size of the United States. So it's not a huge area. You have the smallest country, which is Kosovo, which is in Southeastern Europe, which is less than the size of Connecticut. So it's quite small. And then you have the largest country. And guess what that is? That is Ukraine. Ukraine is slightly smaller than Texas. The average country among these 20 is about the size of Virginia. So that's about, give you the average. The population of the area as a whole is 176 million people. It's 53% of the US population. The largest is actually Ukraine. Ukraine has the largest population, and then Poland and Romania. Those are the largest states in terms of population. Actually, the average population for these 20 countries, guess what? 9 million. Think about 9 million. It's about a little bit bigger than New York City in terms of population. The gross domestic product for these countries is $2.2 trillion, which is about 1/10 of the US gross domestic product. And the average is 110 billion, which would be a medium-sized state in the United States. The largest economy is Poland, and then Romania, Hungary, and Czechia, or people call it Czechia or the Czech Republic. And I'm going to move on. So that's the place I'm looking at, about 20 countries, roughly between Germany and Russia. And I love this part of the world. It's absolutely fascinating. The countries are all a little bit different from each other. And you can travel through a lot of different countries in a fairly short space, in a fairly short amount of time. And they're all fascinating. The cultures are interesting. The music is wonderful. I absolutely love the music. And it stretches from, way down south in the Balkans all the way up to the Baltic Sea. So it covers a fairly large area of the continent of Europe. And interestingly enough, it's characterized by a land between empires. And that has an awful lot to do with the history of Eastern Europe. And if you look at this map that I put up on the screen here, the empire, the big players in this are Russia, the Russian Empire, which has grown and contracted over, eons. And then the German Empire, which, has grown and contracted as well over some period of time. And then further a little bit to the south, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had a lot of different nations that are now independent nations in Eastern Europe. And if I keep going to the south a little bit further, it's not on this map, would be the Ottoman Empire. So here you have this space in Eastern Europe which is jammed up between really big places, Germany, Austro-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. And that really does tell you a lot about the history of it, because these different empires have fought for control over this space over the last hundreds of years. They fought each other for control. The nations of Eastern Europe have fought each other too. And the whole movement has been from independent peoples into nations. And that movement is really an interesting one to watch. The birth of the nationalism movements in the 19th century had a huge impact on Eastern Europe. And those independent nations that resulted from that are really what we see on the map today. Oh, I just want to make one more comment about this. I love this. See that quote? It's actually sort of a paraphrase quote, but the land between empires, and this is from a guy named John Connolly, who wrote a wonderful book, From Peoples into Nations, which is about the history of Eastern Europe. Really wonderful read, by the way. But it's sort of a paraphrase quote from him, filled by little peoples. I mean, you know, if you compare the population of, say, Hungary compared to, say, Russia, right? Filled by little peoples living in desperate fear of annihilation. So here you have all these countries and all these peoples that are crammed up in either absorbed by or facing large empires, and they live, as John Connolly wrote it, in desperate fear of annihilation. So a little unsettling. But what happened? So the big event that I want to talk about today is what happened, 30 years ago. And it really began in, there's a long history to it. And particularly in the 1980s, it was pretty obvious that communism was failing. Communism could not deliver the kind of life that people wanted. The efforts to reform communism had not been very successful. And all of a sudden in 1989, you've got the wall coming down. This is truly a momentous event. And I was living in Germany at the time. So I kind of watched this happen, absolutely amazed. You can imagine. I mean, I spent my career, and I was still on active duty. I spent my career in the Air Force, and never, ever did I imagine something like this would happen, especially relatively peacefully. I mean, it was absolutely stunning. And it began with this really, actually, an Eastern European country kind of opened the spigot on this. Hungary, which has a border with Austria, had allowed people from Czech land, from Germany, East Germany, if they wanted to go visit Austria, they could come through Hungary. Hungary literally opened the gate in 1989, and people started to flow, literally, thousands of people leaving, departing, walking, driving, whatever, literally over to Hungary, abandoning East Germany, and Hungary opening the door for them to travel into Austria. And it was amazing, absolutely amazing. Thousands of people actually camped out in Budapest, waiting for chances to travel over to Austria and leave East Germany behind. Eventually, in November 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. And this was very interesting to me, as you know, at least to say, as an intelligence officer. Certainly we were monitoring Soviet forces. The Soviets did not intervene. They did not intervene. The East German guards honestly didn't know what to do and actually opened up the gate in Berlin. So all of a sudden you've got the wall coming down, literally being pulled apart by huge crowds, and a stunning, absolutely stunning development. In the meantime, several Soviet republics, and in particular, I think of the Baltic states, right? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, had already moved to separate themselves from the Soviet Union. So here you have a Soviet Union that is still in existence, but already you've got nations who are saying to the Soviet leadership, we want to be independent, which was absolutely stunning. And they were already moving in that direction. And in effect, what happened was there was this really interesting question about, well, what are they moving to? Are they moving to be independent, or are they moving to have some rights of sovereignty, but still be part of the Soviet Union? So this was a huge question. So it's 1991 now. and it's December, and this is a fascinating story. Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin is the head of the Russian Republic. He's in a political competition with Gorbachev, and Gorbachev is the head of the Soviet Union. And so Yeltsin travels over to Belarus, and he meets with the head of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, and he also meets with the head of Belarus, who is Stanislav Shuskevich, and they sit down and try to work out an arrangement to replace basically the Soviet Union. And interesting, I'll tell you where the drive for independence came very much from Ukraine. Kravchuk, when he went over there, Ukraine had already conducted a plebiscite type of election and had voted, the Ukrainians had voted, and this is 1991, had voted overwhelmingly for independence. So when Kravchuk met with Yeltsin, he told Yeltsin, you know, we're not really interested in being part of a reformed Soviet Union. We want to be a completely independent republic. And the leader from Belarus, Shuskevich, agreed with that. Yeltsin, Shuskevich, and Kravchuk actually sat down and wrote out the Soviet Union in an agreement that went on, talks that went on overnight, all night long, with lots of vodka fueling the discussion, and literally wrote out the Soviet Union. Yeltsin travels back to Russia and delivers the news to Gorbachev that, by the way, you're head of something that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's an incredible story. It's absolutely incredible. Gorbachev was shocked. He had basically dispatched Yeltsin over to talk to the head of Belarus and Ukraine to work out an arrangement where they would stay as part of the Soviet Union, but with reform to give them more, more autonomy. But that absolutely did not happen. And by the end of December of 1991, the Soviet Union no longer existed, which is absolutely stunning. So oddly enough, in this event that occurred 30 years ago, Eastern Europe, those countries in Eastern Europe in particular, I'm thinking of Belarus and Ukraine, were the actors. They were the actors in this dissolution of the Soviet Union. They also provided the stage for the writing of what became actually the Commonwealth of Independent States. So these states were all independent. So the dissolution of the Soviet Union and its replacement by the Commonwealth of Independent States. An absolutely stunning development, shocked Gorbachev, but basically within a few weeks of that meeting in Belarus, Gorbachev was literally out of work. He no longer had a Soviet Union. So this is stunning. It is absolutely amazing that the Soviet Union is going to dissolve and it's going to break up into the republics, which of course the big one being Russia, but also some fairly sizable ones like Kazakhstan, for example, Ukraine. All of a sudden it's going to break up into these republics that had made up the previous Soviet Union. Well, we were quite nervous about this. I want to tell you, the United States didn't know what to make of this development. And the big concern was what happens to the nuclear weapons? Who's going to be in charge of them? And another concern was, will these independent republics begin fighting among each other? So there was a big concern on the part of the American government at the time about the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the chaos that might result from that. But you know what? We actually got through it without a tremendous amount of chaos. There was some fighting, and there were some absolute sort of rebellions and trying to different countries trying to decide exactly where their borders were. That actually happened, but it wasn't as bad as we had feared. I remember Secretary of State Baker was very worried about the chaos that might result from the breakup of the Soviet Union. But it actually happened relatively peacefully, surprisingly enough. And once we got over that initial shock, and we got used to the idea that the Soviet Union wasn't going to be there anymore, but it was going to be Russia and a whole lot of other independent republics, all of a sudden, everything looked much brighter. And what did we expect then at that point when things didn't turn out as badly as we thought they might? We thought that the world, and in particular the Russians and the other members of the former Soviet Union and even I would say the Warsaw Pact countries, which were not part of the Soviet Union, but were the Soviet satellites, right? Countries like Hungary and Poland, for example. We thought everyone was going to embrace democratic capitalism. Democratic because you have free elections. They're not controlled by the state. They're actually free elections where there is open competition. And capitalism, meaning you're going to have market economies. We really understood, and this certainly was the case, that there was going to be fundamental political and economic change. No doubt about that. The interesting thing was also we expected, and this actually happened, the borders were going to open, and they did. It was phenomenal. I remember being in Germany at the time, how shocking it was to see all of a sudden in Germany a flood of trucks and cars from nations of Eastern Europe that very seldom showed up in Germany. And all of a sudden a huge increase in traffic. I remember that too. Much more traffic on the roads in Germany as a result. And that's because the borders were opening. Now people and goods could flow much more easily than they could before. Then another question was, what about German reunification? Surprisingly, that went much quicker and more smoothly than anyone expected. And Germany indeed, East Germany did indeed fold into Western Germany to make up the new German Republic. We also expected that there would be an expansion of key multinational institutions, which would include, and over time, would this happen or not? And it turns out it did, the European Union and NATO. And indeed, both of those multilateral institutions did expand. And the other interesting thing was we thought it was going to be an opportunity for American leadership. And it was fascinating to me because you can't imagine how many American consultants were over in Russia trying to teach the Russians what it meant to have a democratic country with a market economy. I mean, that was absolutely stunning. I listened to this very interesting program about 8 months ago or so. And the program was a webinar like this, but it was Russian leaders from the period of the 1990s. And they are no longer in power today. But these were folks who were trying to figure out, what does a democratic system look like? How does it work, right? How do you have free elections? How do you do voting? All these things that, that the Russians weren't terribly used to. And the other thing was, what is a capitalist society? How does a market economy function? And one of the commentators in this program I was listening to said, well, we went out and we bought some textbooks, which I thought was fascinating. We bought some textbooks so that we could understand how a market economy works. So there you go. We have a democratic capitalism coming in, fundamental political and economic change going on, all kinds of traffic moving around, people and goods across borders that were really tight and closed before. Germany is reunifying. European Union and NATO are looking at expansion, the possibilities of expansion, or maybe it's just a partnership. And there's huge opportunity for American leadership. All this is occurring in a very, very short period of time. Truly remarkable. And what actually happened? Well, actually, some good things happened. That's the nice thing. We had a positive political and economic changes that occurred throughout Eastern Europe, and there really were. I mean, Eastern Europe, it was interesting because if you think about the economies of Eastern Europe before the fall of the wall, the economies were falling further, and people in Eastern Europe knew this too, by the way. It wasn't something they didn't understand. Their economies were falling further and further behind the West, and Russian economy, obviously, very much so. And all of a sudden, you've got this opportunity to explore how can you structure your economy differently the economies that were producing about all these 20 countries were producing a GDP per capita of about 40% of the West European nations. So the GDP per capita for these 20 countries was about 40% of the Western nations, right? And getting worse by the year. Now, I'll tell you, there have been positive changes, Poland being one of the leading examples of this. The GDP per capita of these Eastern Europe nations today is about 60%. So they haven't caught up, but they've definitely made some ground up, and they're no longer declining in relation to Western Europe. Countries like Czechia and Poland gained a lot of, if I just think about the impact of the German economy in those two countries, gained a lot of economic enterprises they didn't have before, because suddenly they were open to the German expansion into their area. It was a period, and I remember this very well, of excitement, new beginnings, a consultant's paradise. I remember all the consultants coming over. There were conferences, working groups, symposiums, task forces, studies. How do you reshape a part of the world? And the picture I've got showing here on the right is just an example of that. And I was in Bulgaria at the time. I was the defense attaché in Sofia, Bulgaria at the American Embassy. And one of the things we worked on was redesigning the airspace control for Southeastern Europe. Now, the reason we wanted to do that was every country had its own airspace control system. So these countries that were in the old Warsaw Pact really weren't that well integrated with each other. They really weren't. They were quite independent of each other. And the military controlled the airspace. So if you were a civil airliner and you planned to fly from Prague to, wherever, you had to go through the military to get your approvals. Now, they were blanket approvals. You didn't have to do it every time you took off. But the military controlled the airspace. We had launched an initiative where we just redesigned it so that if the countries accepted, and they did, the civil authorities controlled the airspace. So if you were military, now you had to ask permission from the civil authority to fly. I thought that was interesting. So we reversed everything, and it was called the Regional Airspace Initiative. And we had all these conferences, and we did all these things about redesigning the airspace. And by golly, we had a huge international agreement that resulted from that. And it modernized airspace control considerably. Really was a very, very good development. And of course, you can take that example and apply it to a whole lot of other transnational activities that were going on. Also, the European Union and NATO began an expansion process, and they took on new member states. So this was really quite something. So the European Union, you had to go through this kind of checklist to become a member of the European Union. And quite a few states did. But unfortunately, I'll tell you what, the last one was 2014. So it's been a long time. That was Croatia. But NATO also opened up the doors for countries who wanted to join NATO. And really, they really wanted to modernize their military. There was no, and I spent a lot of time working with the Bulgarians on how to modernize the military. In other words, reduce all the senior officers. They had a ton of senior officers, very nice jobs, but probably not needed for a modern military. So we work with Bulgaria and other countries, and in particular, my area was Southeastern Europe, to what do you need to do to become a member of NATO? And we had this really interesting program called the Partnership for Peace, which was kind of NATO kindergarten. So you'd go in there and you'd learn how to become a member of NATO. And if you stuck it out long enough and you were still interested, then eventually you could become a member of NATO. And quite a few nations joined the alliance as a result of this. Now that is interesting. There's been a lot of debate since then about whether this was smart or not. And if you think about the situation we're in today with Ukraine, over and over, what do you hear? You hear NATO expanded right up to our doorstep. And Russia is, Russia actually was quite cooperative with NATO for 10 years. And then when Putin came in, that started to diminish pretty rapidly. But now you hear Russia complaining about NATO on the doorstep and how that can't be permitted. And that we had agreed back in 1991, 92, not to expand NATO, not to include the Warsaw Pact nations and the former members of the Soviet Union. And of course, there's some disagreement about whether we ever promised that or not. And I don't think we actually clearly did. But again, good things. Germany reunited. I think that's really a good thing. Ukraine denuclearized. So in 1994, all those nuclear weapons that were sitting there in Ukraine that were run by the Soviet Union, right? They were dismantled. So some were literally taken apart. Some of the nuclear material, the United States Air Force flew in and flew out with the nuclear material, and some of the systems went back to Russia. But Ukraine denuclearized. So all the nuclear weapon systems were moved out of Ukraine. And also there were some in Belarus and also Kazakhstan as well. And that was a good thing. That was really a good thing. And I remember working in the intelligence business at the time, we were very interested in monitoring that whole activity and what was actually happening to the nuclear material. We were, of course, very interested in. Czechoslovakia split. Czechoslovakia had always had this kind of uneasy relationship between the Czech lands and the Slovak lands. And finally, the country divided in two. So you ended up with Czechia, or the Czech Republic, on one side and Slovakia on the other. And that was really a good split in the sense that it was peaceful and fairly friendly. So it was a good development overall. Now, the bad part of the story. Sorry about that. A lot of good things were going on. Things were dynamic. Things were changing. The economies in general in Eastern Europe were improving, and they were improving faster. They were actually catching up to some degree on the economies in Western Europe. But we had some bad things happen as well. So this didn't turn out to be quite as wonderful a period as we expected. Yugoslavia, as you all know, broke apart violently. So there was quite the republics that had made up Yugoslavia, like Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Kosovo, Montenegro, those all really started fighting each other. The Serbians were trying to maintain Greater Serbia, and we had some terrific wars going on in the Balkans for years. And again, I was stationed in the Balkans, and I remember in particular, I was pretty heavily involved in the Kosovo when the Albanians in Kosovo decided they wanted to be independent of Serbia, and the Serbians decided they were going to launch a tank attack against the Albanians. I remember what we did to try to prevent that. And I remember the air campaign that we conducted over that period of time to try to convince the Serbians to back off. And eventually it was successful. It was interesting because in Bulgaria, I was working with the Bulgarians trying to, this is an unusual job. This is why a career can take you places you never expect, right? I was talking to the Bulgarians to borrow their airspace to attack Serbia. It was sort of bizarre when you think about it. The Bulgarians and the Serbians are good friends, right? The Bulgarians love the Russians because the Russians freed them from the Turks. The Serbians are good friends of the Russians as well. So here you've got Bulgaria not too eager to have Serbia being bombed by NATO, which was happening, right, in the Kosovo incident. And I'm going to the Bulgarian government saying, we'd like to fly over your airspace to bomb your neighbor. And that was certainly interesting. Finally got the Bulgarian Air Force commander, calls me up one day and says, come over to the embassy, but don't bring a translator. He didn't want any record of this. It's fascinating. So he says, I go to his office and thank God the State Department had taught me Bulgarian before I went to Bulgaria. But he says, we're going to give you our airspace at night so you can fly over. We're going to shut down our radars because they all look like Serbian radars. They're the same equipment. And you can fly over and you can do your missions over Bulgaria. And he gave us permission to do it. Said, can I tell NATO? And I said, yeah, you can tell NATO. So I did. And the Bulgarians were really part of the NATO effort to try to convince Serbia to back off of Kosovo. Well, it was Yugoslavia was a sad story, but now obviously we've got a bunch of independent states that resulted from the breakup of Yugoslavia. None of that peaceful. 9/11 occurred. The U.S. launched the war on terror, and the war on terror really hugely, just major distraction for the United States, right? And we're trying to blame Iraq for the attack on the World Trade Center. And then we're going into Afghanistan, which turned into a 20-year commitment. So obviously that had a huge impact on the United States and where our efforts went in the world. Then there was a financial crash in 2008. And the financial crash really had a huge impact on the European countries, as well as the United States, and also led people to question, well, what is this democratic capitalism we're talking about here? Does it really work? That was a big question that people had. And then Russia this is the lead up to where we are today. Russia seized Crimea, which had been given to Ukraine in the 1950s. Russia seized Crimea back literally from Ukraine and then occupied this little bit of eastern Ukraine called the Donbas region. And they did that in theory to protect the Russian, the ethnic Russians, I guess I could describe them, in that part of Ukraine. That's what they said anyway. And then, of course, there was the pandemic. So the pandemic has obviously caused a lot of problems, and of course has continued to be a threat to all of the countries throughout the world, in fact, but in particular in Europe, and particularly if I look at Southeastern Europe, and you go down to the Balkans when I think about the Balkans, and the poverty down there, which continues today, and the pandemic adding to the problems that the disease was already causing. So it was an interesting time. We had some good things going on. We had some expectations that the world was going to be a better place. In some ways it was, in some ways it wasn't. I guess that's human history for you. The other thing, I think this is really important too, that changed in that 30-year period, the entire international system changed. China rose. China is, in 30 years, amazing growth in Chinese power, economic power, and military power. And Russia reemerged. So Russia, and really this was largely under Putin's leadership for the last 2 decades. Putin has put a lot of money into, among other things, the military. He's also given Russia a stable government, so they didn't have the chaos. I remember when Susan Welch and Susan was teaching a course at Ollie, talking about the chaos in the 1990s in Russia under Boris Yeltsin's leadership. He brought stability to Russia politically. Now, of course, he did that by murdering some of his opponents, exiling others, jailing others. But if you could say maybe the good part about that, Russia became stable, and Russia really reemerged on the international stage as a great power. I think that's true today. The United States, on the other hand, declined. So if you look at who's running the interactions that are global interactions today, the United States clearly has declined in the last, I would say, 20 years. In other words, the United States does not have the power to shape the international system the way it did 20 years ago. And then, of course, there's been the rise of populist political movements, strongman governments, and even in places that are, became part of the Western sort of democratic model, like Poland, for example. Those, and I would include the United States in that as well. And then the capitalist economic model, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, failed to deliver quite as much as expected. So a lot of people have questioned that model and whether that's really a good way to plan the economic state of nations. Multilateral institutions lost luster and they stagnated. So if you think about the European Union, it's really in kind of a stagnant mode today. It hasn't brought any new members since Croatia in 2014. So it's not expanding anymore. it regretted some of the expansions that when it brought in Bulgaria and Romania, those countries had huge problems, economic problems, and they also had a lot of corruption. And all of a sudden they're members of the European Union. They really aren't able to meet the standards of the, the older members of the European Union. So, and then you had Brexit. So, Britain leaves the European Union, and that further undermines the capacity and the attractiveness of the European Union. And NATO, the same thing. NATO has declined in terms of, its level of activity, participation. Russia has withdrawn its representation in Brussels. So Russia is no longer represented there. NATO has not expanded for quite a while now and doesn't probably have any intention to expand. And I would say that includes the country of Ukraine. So these multilateral institutions that had been kind of the model for how the political system works have really stagnated in the last 20 years. Germany, interestingly enough, emerged as an anchor in Europe. Under the 16-year leadership of Angela Merkel, Germany really did rise to power in Europe with by far the strongest economy. Not much of a military player, certainly, but clearly a very, very strong economy. And with Angela Merkel's very steady leadership over the last 16 years, Germany really has emerged as the leader for the entire continent. So where are we now? And I thought I'd take a quick spin through Eastern Europe to show you where we are now. We're not at the end of history. I remember a piece being written about the end of history in the early 1990s because of the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of democratic capitalism, and all of us were going to be the same, right? Well, that hasn't happened. We're not at the end of history, but in some ways we're in a better place. Now, I would say Ukraine is an exception to that right now. But let me go through these, take you on a little spin through Eastern Europe and talk about the Baltics, the Belarus, which is an interesting place, Poland, Ukraine, Czechia and Slovakia, Hungary, and the Balkans. So we'll take a little quick travel through Eastern Europe. And as I said, when I opened up tonight, I'm going to end up with some little more discussion about Ukraine. If you go to the north of the continent, you have the Baltic republics and Belarus. The Baltic republics were incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940 as a result of the the German-Russian agreement in 1940, where they became allies on at least a very temporary basis, lasted about 2 years before Germany invaded Russia. But when that happened, Russia moved west and acquired Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia as Soviet republics. And they also moved all the way into Poland. So they extended their empire outside of Ukraine and went into Poland as well. So you've got Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. As soon as the Soviet Union looked like it was going to break up, these countries all moved as rapidly as they could to independence. And they're all obviously independent states today. And their big concern, as you can imagine, is security. They're right on the Russian border, right? So they're on the Russian border. They're very, they're nervous about everything Russia does. And they want to make sure that they don't become reincorporated into Russia as part of a kind of new Soviet Union. So they became NATO members pretty quickly. They decided they wanted to be members of NATO to get that extra protection. Belarus, interestingly enough, is really a client state of Russia now. Belarus had these exercises that were just held that are threatening to Ukraine. Belarus had tremendously massive demonstrations last year where they wanted to kick out Lukashenko, the leader who's been there for now, about 18 years running the country, an autocrat, clearly, and really a complete ally of Putin. And the picture there on the right is Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya, And she's a leader of the Belarusian, she's now out of the country. She had to go into exile, but she's the leader of the Belarusian opposition. So Belarus basically is really a satellite of Russia at this point. Lukashenko knows that he depends totally on Russia for his political survival. And if you've been seeing the news lately, you've seen a great deal of news about migrants traveling, and a lot of migrants come from the Kurdish area of Iraq. They end up in Belarus, and they're literally being brought there by the Belarusians and then being pushed toward Poland and Lithuania. And this is to destabilize NATO and the European Union, which I think is certainly an interesting tactic. And so Poland, Lithuania have been trying to keep these migrants that are being brought in, some from Africa, but largely from Iraq, out of their countries. And Belarus has been pushing them, Belarus sneaks them up literally to the borders at night and then shows them ways to get across the border, which is certainly a bizarre way to maintain good relations with Poland and Lithuania. And then if we go from the Baltic, so we're going up to the Baltic Sea, all the way down to the Black Sea, the countries you run into in that particular belt really are, the major countries are Poland and Ukraine. And of course, Poland very much has a big security concern. They are not, they've never been good friends of the Russians, in fact, and they are very happy to be members of NATO. Ukraine would like to be a member of NATO, but probably I don't think has any prospect of doing that. But obviously, Ukraine has tremendous security concerns. And the picture on the left there are Russian, unidentified Russian troops occupying Crimea. So obviously, Ukraine has huge security issues with the occupation in Donbass and also the return of Crimea to Russia. NATO, yes, for Poland. The European Union, yes, for Poland, but interestingly enough, not for Ukraine, neither NATO or the European Union. And Poland has drifted off into an interesting direction politically. Poland has become something of it's kind of a populist, autocratic government that runs Poland right now. I wouldn't describe it as a model of democracy at this point. The leaders of Poland have been dismantling the judiciary whenever the judiciary acts as an independent body. They've been controlling elections. And Poland is not in a good place right now politically. And the European Union has actually sanctioned one of its members, Poland, which I think is certainly interesting. So you've got issues in this area. Poland and Ukraine have issues of governance. Autocracy, one of the main issues here, if I pay attention to Poland, but you've also got Ukraine, which has tremendous issues with corruption in their governance. And then if we go to the center, we can look at Czechia, Slovakia, and Hungary. They're members of NATO, they're members of the European Union, but interestingly enough, Hungary, the one that's a little lighter in color there, has made itself a very autocratic government, kicked out the Central European University, made it leave and go to Vienna, has carried out, I would say, anti-Semitic campaigns. Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, has tried to make sure he stays in power as long as possible. He set himself up as very much a right-wing, not quite dictator, but certainly an autocrat. And this picture here on the right is Tucker Carlson talking to Viktor Orban, because Viktor Orban was hosting a Christian conference back in the summer in Budapest. So we've got issues of governance, and particularly in Hungary, not so much in Czechia or Slovakia, but certainly in Hungary. Is there going to be a united opposition to these autocratic leaders like in Poland and in Hungary? Well, the one thing I could say that's good that's going on right now, in both countries, the opposition, which was very fragmented, the opposition has formed, again, a kind of alliance where they're going to challenge these leaders in the next election. So I think that's a good thing. If we go to the south, the Balkans, there is continued ethnic and national conflict going on in the Balkans, without a doubt. In particular, Serbia is still kind of boiling away. Serbia, Kosovo, those Bosnia Herzegovina, those places really have not settled down into any kind of a model of, I would say, democratic government. Serbia, the Serbs in Bosnia Herzegovina have basically set up their own, what they consider their own nation, even though they're really part of a tripartite government. And Kosovo and Serbia have multiple disagreements about Serbians who live in Kosovo and what is their border. And if a Serbian is living in Kosovo, does that Serbian have full citizenship? And those are all open questions. And Serbia does not exactly have a model of a democratic government either. They've got a bit of a bit of a dictator as the head of Serbia right now. So not a good model for anyone to look at. NATO membership, there are quite a few of the Balkan countries like Kosovo, Montenegro, Bulgaria, Romania have become members, and Albania even have become members of NATO. But not very many have become members of the European Union. That's just not happened down there. Bulgaria and Romania did, but very few countries after that, except Croatia, have been admitted to the European Union. And that's because of really the high level of corruption that exists in all these places in the Balkans. And that's certainly a problem, certainly a concern for the European Union. The picture on the right here is the Kosovo, 3 troops from the Kosovo army. And these troops are participating in something called the Partnership for Peace, which I mentioned earlier is kind of a kindergarten for NATO. Kosovo is not a member of NATO yet, but they are certainly striving to become one. So what does this all mean 30 years later? Where did we land in all this? Well, the little people are still here. They haven't been annihilated. History did not end, but the transition, as I've been telling you, has been very fraught, without a doubt. And global changes make this transition more and more challenging. And I could add that when I wrote this last line, I wasn't thinking of where we are today, but ongoing and potential conflicts add risk. So where we are in Eastern Europe is we are still in a land that has multiple conflicts going on, and some of them could be quite severe. So in some cases, some of the political problems have not been resolved and are still going on in Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europe could become an arena for conflict, which we don't really want. And so I remember when I did this presentation in the summer, this was my last picture. And it was a picture of the Rila Monastery in Bulgaria. Notice those beautiful mountains in the background. Bulgaria is a gorgeous country. If you ever get a chance to visit, do that. But Bulgarian is largely Orthodox in religion, Slavic in language. And this was the Rila Monastery, and I got to end my lecture on this very nice, beautiful picture that I took when I was visiting the monastery. Well, now guess what? if anyone saw Laura Henry's presentation last week, they'll remember this. This is from the New York Times, and it's a slide showing the Russian armed forces that are literally surrounding Ukraine on almost, not quite on the western side, but pretty much certainly on the northern, eastern, and southern sides. And I've heard an estimate today of 150,000 troops involved. So the graphic says 130,000. Whatever the number is, it's a big number. And I'll tell you, the Russians Putin has really put a lot of money into the Russian military. It is a completely different military than what it was in the 1990s. So in the last 30 years, if nothing else has happened, unfortunately, the Russian military has become much more capable than it was 30 years ago. And now surround Ukraine with obvious intent to threaten the country. And this is a picture here of a Russian submarine going through the Bosphorus. So this is a picture in Istanbul. And the Russians have not only put in a whole lot of land forces and air forces, they've also boosted their Black Sea fleet. And their Black Sea fleet is traveling between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and again, making part of that threat to Ukraine. So what does Putin want? Well, I think it's interesting, and I'm going to give you, and of course, this is not a lecture about Russia, but I can't resist with what's going on right now. But it's kind of interesting. So Putin has surrounded Ukraine, right? And he's got a lot of forces there, and there's certainly clearly a threat to invade. And he's telling he's telling the United States, this is really dictated for the United States consumption, right? He wants the United States to agree that NATO is going to not be present in any of the former Soviet republics. NATO will not be present there. And it already is. So, you'd have to withdraw from those countries, and doesn't expect that. And in fact, he even said at one point he wants NATO forces withdrawn from Eastern Europe, which would be quite a trick if that ever happens. So what does Putin want? I honestly believe, this is just some of my thoughts on this, I believe he really wants to restore the Soviet Union to some degree. It's not going to be the Soviet Union, but it's going to be something like the Soviet Union. It's going to be where he has client republics, and Ukraine, he certainly intends to make it one of those. Belarus already is. And what he's done in Kazakhstan right now, with the unrest that occurred in Kazakhstan a couple of months ago, he has troops stationed in Kazakhstan as well. So he's going to hang on influentially anyway. They're not part of the Russian Republic, obviously, but he's going to hang on to his influence in Central Asia, which was all part of the Soviet Union at one time. And he's going to also try to extend that westward. So in a way, I think he's trying to recreate, to some degree, the Soviet Union. He thought that the disappearance of the Soviet Union was a great, great mistake. He also wants to protect his domestic position. This is very important to Putin. He's been in power for 20 years. In theory, he could be in power until 2036, the way he structured the government there. And he's also engaged literally in a fight against the United States. And if I could, I want to quote from an issue of Foreign Affairs. And this is the writer Fiona Hill. And she says that Putin sits at the apex of a personalized and semi-privatized kleptocratic system that straddles the Russian state and its institutions and population. If Putin wants to retain the presidency until 2036, which he could, he will have to maintain a high level of control or even increase it, since any slippage might be perceived as weakness. To do so, Putin has to defer or defeat any opponents, foreign or domestic, who have the capacity to undermine his regime. And I really do believe that Putin thinks Ukraine, if it becomes a Western-leaning country, if it ever becomes a member of the European Union, and it really becomes more so than it is today, a democratic state, I think Putin regards that personally as a threat to his rule in Russia and as a threat to Russia itself, because it would not be a model sitting right on the border with Russia that he would want to have. And Putin also stresses, and this is Fiona Hill again, stresses that the United States still poses a military threat and that it aims to bring Russia to its knees. Putin's constant refrain is that the contest between Russia and the United States is a perpetual Darwinian struggle, and that without his leadership, Russia will not survive. Without Putin, there is no Russia. So that's from Fiona Hill, which I think are very, very interesting comments. So what does he want in Ukraine? I do believe he really wants something that's more along the model of Belarus, which is something of a client state, basically. But he doesn't want Western influence, and he certainly doesn't want Western forces in Ukraine. So what is the future for Ukraine? I don't know. I had to add this slide as well. We don't know. And it depends on it really depends on what Putin decides to do. Will he actually invade? Will he withdraw his troops? That's a huge question. And if he does invade, what would be the consequences of that, and what would you end up with as far as a Ukrainian republic is concerned? So that is that's my presentation. And I would say, I guess, if anybody has any questions, I'm perfectly willing to address questions. Miles, do you have any comments to make at this point?
I think you actually took care of it, Bill, because really we just want to open this up to a discussion.
Sure. Okay.
Please speak up, or if you feel better about raising your hand and being called on, we will certainly call upon you. Thank you, Bill. That was just a really engaging conversation about this topics. Yep, thank you. And at this point, we should be able to see all of us. We had a couple drop out, but we're just under 50. So
Yep.
please speak up, and V, jump right in.
Always hard to get people to start with a question. So I'm waiting for a question, but I'm going to jump right into it. And poor Susan is going to say, well, why is he picking on me? Well, Susan taught a great course. She taught a great course at Ollie on Russian. So Susan, any comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I have a lot, but I was waiting to see what some of the other people thought.
Bill, I had a question.
Yes, please.
I guess as these negotiations with the EU and the United States and Russia continue, there's a feeling that you have to offer something to Putin. So far, we've just been saying no to all of his demands.
Yep.
Is there anything, and of course, Ukraine gets a say in this and decisions that will affect their future, but there's been talk of some possible neutral status for the Ukraine that would allow them to continue to have sovereignty, but have some cooperation with Europe. And I guess Finland's role in the past has been used as an example, although the Finns don't recommend that.
Right.
But is there anything that you can think of that would satisfy Putin to some extent and still protect the interests of Ukraine and the EU and the West in general?
Yeah, I think there is potential. I think you've got a good point. I think potentially, and some kind of agreement. Now, however you word this, it's kind of tricky, but I think an agreement, and I hate to use the term neutralization, but I'll use it because it depends on, how you want to describe it, but some sort of an assurance to Putin that there will not be NATO forces stationed in Ukraine, whether that's forever or for a period of time, whatever it may be, might help resolve the situation. The other thing I would think is I would think that Putin might be wanting also for the Donbas region and the two provinces of the Donbas region to be granted some kind of political autonomy, which Ukraine has not terribly eager to do, but I think that would maybe be part of an agreement. So perhaps if you could get the Donbas region in a situation of political economy, but still part of political autonomy, but still part of Ukraine, and you could state in one way or another that NATO has no intention to expand into Ukraine, I think there might be the basis of an agreement. But I'm not sure. Putin has he's got a pretty hard line out there right now. And it almost seems like he presented his initial demand in a way that was, you couldn't, even though people try to take a tough position when they launch a bargaining process, his demands were pretty extreme and obviously weren't going to be met. So whether that's those two things are feasible or not, I don't know, but I think that might be the basis for some kind of an agreement.
Dawn did go on to add a question, which you've partly answered, I think, but her question is, given Putin's belief that Russia should prevail, where do you think the standoff is headed?
Yeah, right now, I am leaning toward Putin actually invading. And I think it would be stupid. I think it'd be incredibly stupid, but he might do it. And one of the reasons is because of the question I asked Laura Henry last week the question was, how does Putin back down now? This is such a gigantic show on the part of Russia right now with all these forces that had been engaged and put in place, that a back down would be somewhat difficult. I think Putin would have to have a pretty good agreement in order to step back from this right now. And I got to admit, when I think about 1938, I think of Sudetenland, when Germany wanted to go into Czechoslovakia to so-called protect the Germans, right? And the French and the British were negotiating with Hitler. The language that Putin is using right now is very similar to what Hitler was using in 1938, about denying the legitimacy of the Czechoslovak Republic, whether it's really a real republic or not. Hitler didn't regard it as one. And also about the protection of the German minority in Czechoslovakia. And because they spoke German, they weren't Czech. They spoke German, they were Germans, right? And so they need the protection of the German, the German nation. And the language is very similar. And of course, people look at that, look back at history, giving in to Hitler in that regard, giving in to Hitler for the occupation of Sudetenland only led to bigger things. What would Putin do? I don't know. I don't know if he would agree. And if he does agree, if he does invade Ukraine, I have to wonder too about the rest of Eastern Europe, in particular the Balkan states. What do the Baltic states then do if that actually happens? So
Well,
and
you
Timothy,
you can see those others in chat. Do you want to
Right.
just
yeah,
pick up on that?
I see Timothy. Yep. Timothy.
Yeah, this is a little off topic and books have been written about it, but let me discuss quickly. You know, you go a little further east and you see like Georgia and Chechnya, at least to my not very well informed eye, there's been, there was substantial military involvement by the Russians in those places. And is there any quick summary? Why was that so different from Eastern Europe and how that things transpired?
Yeah, it's interesting. And one of the Russians' means of control is to go into a country, take part of the country, like they did in Donbass, right? And they've done in Georgia as well, and use that as leverage to control the actions of the country from that point on. So they don't have to go in and occupy the entire country. They take a piece of it and they control it, and they use that to actually control the government of that country. So that's what they've done in Georgia. And I think that might possibly be a model for Ukraine. I'm not really sure, but they've certainly exercised that. And they don't have to go in and seize the entire country and then try to run it, which would be difficult. And a country the big difference in Ukraine and Georgia is the size. Ukraine is just big. And the other difference is Ukraine is a lot closer to Western Europe than Georgia is. And Susan, did you have a question or a comment?
I could say a lot of things, but I'll try to boil it down. Let me refer to Bill Burns, the CIA director now, his autobiography or his memoir, The Back Channel, which is well worth reading. He was the US ambassador in Russia for a couple of years and has a great deal of experience with Russia, has been an intermediary for President Biden to Putin, etc. But in his autobiography, he says that the Russians have such a weight of history in what their reactions are to things today, that if the Americans built a Walt Disney theme park in Poland, the Russians would be distinctly nervous. Now, I think that I start with that anecdote because I want to emphasize the fact that, well, I don't think the issue is Ukraine for Moscow. I think the issue that Ukraine is as one of my Russian friends said to me just yesterday, Ukraine is a pawn in the game between Russia and the United States. The issue is Russia and the United States, and whether Russia will be accepted as a great power, as a worthy interlocutor, rather than just some little, as Obama called Russia, a regional power. So Russia wants to be recognized as having its own dog in the fight, and that's what it's really about. And so it's not just about Putin backing down. I don't think he has any desire to invade Ukraine. What would they do with Ukraine? The economy is bankrupt. It's totally corrupt. It's even more corrupt than Russia. He's trying to make a point. He's trying to get the attention of the United States, and he has done so.
I think that's a really good point, Susan. I think you're right. I think that's absolutely true. Putin wants to be recognized, wants Russia to be recognized as a great power and to have the rights, whatever that may be, the rights and authority that go with great powership. And I think that's absolutely true. So that's why, another reason I don't think sanctions are a very good deterrent. So threatening Russia with sanctions, I don't think means much to him, because I think Putin regards sanctions as a much smaller scale issue than the issue of great powership. I really do. This is a far bigger question than anything that sanctions could possibly deal with. And the other thing is, Russia is still somewhat autarkic in terms of its economic structure and has an enormous bank account. So Russia can survive sanctions pretty well for a long period of time. And I don't think sanctions are going to be a deterrent. But I do think you're right about Russia's perception of the world and his competition with the United States. So very good. So thanks for that comment. Anybody else want to venture?
Bill, there's some in the chat if you want to look at
some in the
those.
chat. Okay. I've been looking at the chat here. And here's one that says it's fairly likely that both sides really don't want, I presume, a major war, and would be happy to have some face-saving way to end the standoff. What would you think of an agreement by both sides to pull armed forces 100 kilometers back from the frontiers, from Estonia to the Black Sea? I would suppose, again, if you're talking about trying to neutralize it from a military perspective, this might be a possibility. And of course, but one of the problems you run into is these other countries are independent countries. And to get them to agree to something that looks like threatens their sovereignty or their security, because if you take the Baltic states, for example, they are very concerned about their security, then it's difficult to get agreement. And if you do get agreement by forcing it on these countries, then you've probably significantly impacted the kind of the structure and purposes of the NATO alliance. So that's just kind of a thought in that. It's a tough one. It's really a tough one. I honestly, my own personal opinion is Ukraine, somehow we need to say, Ukraine, you're not going to be a member of NATO. And the other thing, I think Ukraine, you need to, even though V, you brought this up, as you know, Finland is, I hate to say Finlandization, because the Finns don't like that term, and they weren't happy with being, their political process, everything was influenced by the need to keep Russia, Soviet Union at the time, happy. And the Finns didn't think, they don't want that wished on anybody. But I think that might possibly be an answer for Ukraine, at least to get us through what now is a rough period. And I've got one more question here, and this says, Bill, how many languages did you have to learn over the course of your career, and what were they? So I was a French student in high school. Then I took German in college, so I learned those two. And then I did Turkish. And then I did, I did some Korean, but I never got really good in Korean at all. I was in Korea, but I just didn't do well in the language. And then the State Department sent me to the embassy in Bulgaria. They thought at age 53, I thought, your brains are pretty set by that time. You can't handle new languages. They taught me Bulgarian, of all things, which is really a cool language, and Cyrillic alphabet and everything. And I absolutely loved it. I had more fun learning Bulgarian than you can believe. And of course, then I got to Portland and discovered Bulgarian is not widely spoken. which was very disappointing to me. So yeah, so German, French, and when I was in Europe in dealing with NATO officers, we'd have intelligence conferences, right? The French and the British and the Germans and all of us would get together for intelligence reasons. And the Germans would speak in German and the French would speak in French. And we would, the Brits and the Americans speak in English, and everybody understood each other. It's just a lot. It's easy to understand a language relative to speaking it. Speaking it is really hard, but understanding is not so hard. So we could conduct conferences in multiple languages and everyone would understand each other, which was fine. So, and then, okay, I think, Betsy, are you telling us we're done?
I'm not telling anything.
Oh, I said, Betsy says your experience was appreciated.
Oh, no, I love to hear about, I mean, it really was important to me to hear that.
Yeah, good.
I appreciate it.
Sure, absolutely. Betsy, it was my pleasure. I'm just glad to do it. And
Yeah,
of course,
thank you.
my wife says I love to talk. So this is just another opportunity.
Well, you have a lot to talk about.
And Susan, did you have a comment?
I have one more comment on the question of Finlandization and
Mhm.
whatnot. There's a Bloomberg article today, Clive Barnes, I think, on the question of Finland and Finlandization, in which he
Mhm.
makes the point that the Finns have done really well.
They have done
I mean,
very well.
They don't like the word Finlandization, but their relationship has worked out fine.
Yeah.
And they're pro-Western, and they don't consider themselves Russians, and they're cool.
Yeah.
I would say otherwise, just one quick point, which is that there have been quite a few interesting and different lines coming out from distinguished Americans that are different from what's coming out from Fiona Hill, for example, or
Mhm,
Anthony Blinken,
Right.
or Jake Sullivan, which is, for example, Jeffrey Sachs, who's a name I'm sure you know,
Oh,
the
yeah.
economist of shock therapy. He has a recent article, I've forgotten where, I could find out if you like, on the idea of a neutral solution for Ukraine along the lines of Finland, Sweden, Austria, countries like that who are not members of NATO, but have worked out various different arrangements for coexistence. So
Yep.
not only he, but he's one that struck me because I wouldn't have expected that from him.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you for commenting on that, Susan. That's very interesting. And I honestly, this is a personal opinion. I believe that's the route we probably need to go. And I think Finland over the years, I think you're absolutely right, was a very successful country, successful economically, politically. And I remember reading a book about Russia, this is probably a couple of years ago, how much the Russians absolutely loved to travel to Finland because it was a completely modern country and far ahead of Russia in terms of the quality of life. But Finland did fine. They did fine under those circumstances. And you could even say Austria did as well. And Austria was neutralized at the end of World War II, of course, which made sense because that got the Russians out of Austria and got in fact, all forces withdrew from Austria at the time it was neutralized, which turned out to be a good thing for Austria. Absolutely. So is that it? Are we done? Did anybody else have any other questions or comments? So it'll be interesting, I gotta say, to see what happens. Now, interesting is probably a funny word to use, but as you know, I love world affairs, so everything is interesting to me, but it certainly will be interesting to see what happens with Ukraine over the next, I would say the next week. 10 days is critical. So we'll see.
Well, Bill, thank you so much. You've given us a lot of depth of understanding about this region that's really in the spotlight right now. And
it's a great region. I recommend everybody go visit. Don't go to Ukraine right now.
It's too cold.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
please don't forget to check out some of the books that are on the Camden Conference list, either before or after the conference. We've got them for you at the library. Thanks,
Thank
Fee.
you,
Thank you,
Miles.
Bill. Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Miles. Yeah.
thank
Good
you,
night.
everyone.